Hey, I'm Dave Cousins from Carbon Express. I'm going to walk you through how I set up, build, tune, basically everything I do with my Tank 27s or any Carbon Express arrow before I shoot it. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my arrow, any arrow, indoor arrow, outdoor arrow, hunting arrow, doesn't matter, and I'm going to put it on the spinner, and I'm going to take a real close look at the back end and the front end. And what I'm looking for is to see if I need to square up any end at all, just based on the finishing process, how the arrows come off the machine at the factory. And what this one is showing me right here is the back needs to be squared up a little bit. The front I'm not so concerned about because this is 32.5 inches long and I'm going to cut it down to 29 anyway. So I'm taking 2.5 inches right off the front. So I'm not really concerned with that end just yet. But like I said, putting it on the spinner shows me that the back face isn't completely square yet. I'm going to use the G5 ASD arrow squaring tool with a diamond face on here to clean that up. And to explain why I'm going to clean that up is because when you start stacking components together on an unsquare surface, what happens is all those components become misaligned. So you have a knock bushing, a bulldog collar, and a knock. And if all that stuff's not aligned in the center of the shaft, square and true, then your accuracy is going to suffer and your tunability is not going to be what it needs to be. So I'm going to put this on the ASD, going to run it a few times, going to put it on the spinner, give it a roll. Actually looks pretty good. And one thing you can do, and you can go a step further, is take your finger, put it on the back face of the arrow shaft, and turn the arrow shaft. And if you feel any bump or any deviation there, it's not quite square. And I can feel just one small bump that I couldn't see on the spinner. So I'm going to put it on the ASD and just give it a couple more rolls, and that should clean that up really nicely. Perfect, nice and flat. So now I've got a nice flat square surface to work with on the back of the arrow shaft, all right? So next thing I'm going to do, and just for me as a little pro tip, it's a thing I've always done with my arrows, no matter what brand I shot, no matter what material they were made of, is all of these arrows are made from a sheet of pre-preg material, okay? So they're rolled together and they're formed on a seam, right? And even though we have the best 360 spine control in the entire industry for an all carbon shaft, I'm still going to index this shaft, fletch them all the same way, and start my tuning and shooting from there. So what I like to do is look inside the shaft, locate the seam, index and mark it on the outside, and I'm going to orient those marks all in the same place and fletch on that so that all my arrows are rotated to the same place. And for me, it just cuts my time to tune down, and I think it definitely elevates my accuracy, and for me, it's peace of mind. So this is real easy to do. Just hold the shaft to the light, look down inside it, and very quickly you can recognize and mark the seam. And I'll just place a mark on it on the outside like that. Now, when I'm installing components and cleaning this arrow shaft, gotta remember, try not to wipe the mark off when you use your alcohol, your isopropyl alcohol, your MEK, whatever it is you use, denatured alcohol, what have you. So after I've got that marked, next thing I'm going to do is install some rear end components on this so I can get it in the fletching jig. I'm going to install the bulldog knock collar. Myself, I actually prefer to score the bushing with a blade, and what that does by going down the bushing in several places, it actually creates a small groove of aluminum and pushes aluminum out the sides. It puts a small ridge on it, and that makes it more of a compression and pressure fit. It's easier for me to change components from one shaft to the next, etc. And it cuts down on build time for me a little bit, but that's just what I happen to do. But the factory's definitely going to recommend that you use a low temp hot melt. Just going to score that half a dozen different places with a blade. Be very careful, it's very sharp. And then I'll just press fit and sink that bushing right in there. And you could just do it with your hands. It doesn't go in super tight. Now, next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to put my knock in. Now, I use the Carbon Express Launchpad 244 bushing nocks. It's actually the most precise and consistent knock that I've tested and experimented with in a little while. When you go to put these nocks in the bushings, any knock in any bushing really, You should probably apply a little bit of light lubricant to it because these are going to fit really, really tight. That's usually a quality sign of a good knock, is how snug it fits in the bushing for it. If this knock goes in there loose at all, then not only will concentricity be out from the beginning, the location of the knock to the center of the shaft, but as you shoot this, that alignment will break down and change, and that's going to hurt your accuracy and it's going to hurt your tune. So this is actually some Carbon Express rail lube that I happen to have here. Just going to put a little bit of that on the knock. Going to get the knock started with my fingers. Use the Carbon Express Launchpad knock tool and sink the knock down. Good snug fit. Now when I go to put this in the jig, I'm going to clamp it. I'm going to put a vane in there, and I'm going to rotate and orient the shaft so that I'm placing a vane directly on the seam line that I've made. Moving on to fletching now. Pull up my Blitzenberger jig. Install the arrow shaft in the jig. A lot of people will talk about how far down the clamp or how far up or down the shaft to put your vanes. For me, I've kind of always used the same line on my Blitzenberger clamp for over 25 years. It's just where they go for me. However though, if you have a lot of face contact with your arrow shaft or with the bowstring, you're going to want to look at pushing your vanes further up the arrow shaft towards the point end, closer to the middle of the shaft, so that those vanes aren't causing contact, with your face, or if you have a big, beard or whatever, try to get and eliminate contact by pushing those vanes forward. People ask me, is it more accurate to have them closer to the back of the arrow or further from the back of the arrow? Honestly, I can't tell the difference. It's indistinguishable for me. However, move them to a place where you get as much clearance as you possibly can, because face contact with the arrow shaft of any type or the vanes is going to cause you tuning and grouping issues. So we don't want that. We're building a very precise high-end arrow here, so we don't want to have any of those things in there that are going to hurt our accuracy. Now, the next thing people will ask me about is, Dave, do you shoot a left offset or a right offset? Do you shoot a helical? Do you shoot straight? In all honesty, the more drag you put on an arrow shaft with a really hard helical or a really big vane or feather, yes, it will aid in more stability sooner out of the bow. However, as that arrow travels downrange and drag becomes a factor, if too much drag is placed on the arrow, then it can hurt your accuracy and your groups will open up. So for all my arrows, I fletch them all on the same jig with a straight clamp with the same offset. People ask, well, is it 1 degree, 2 degree? Honestly, I don't know. From the front of the vane to the back of the vane, it's offset about the width of the vane. It's not a ton of drag, it's just enough to keep the arrow turning the natural direction that the bow casts as a bear shaft. So if I clock my bear shaft and my bow turns an arrow shaft to the right, I'll fletch to the right. If my bow turns an arrow shaft to the left, I'll fletch to the left. The particular bow I'm setting these up for turns a bear shaft counterclockwise to the left. So I'm fletching with a straight clamp with a slight left offset, about the width of a vane from front to back on a 3-inch Gas Pro vane, 280 right here, my signature series. So I've got the arrow in the clamp, the arrow in the jig, the vane in the clamp. When I place this in here, I have this mark that I've made on the arrow shaft. And I'm going to rotate the knock and hold the knock receiver, rotating the knock, so that I am placing a vane directly on that seam. And that's going to be my indexing vane. That's going to be the vane that I rotate to all the same place, so all my arrows are indexed and coming out of the bow exactly the same. Now that I have the arrow shaft oriented in the jig so that I'm placing my vane on that indexing mark on the seam that I've made, I'm going to take the arrow out of the jig, and it's important to clean the arrow shaft. You need a good, clean, dry, dirt-free surface for the glue to adhere to. And today I'm going to use 91% isopropyl alcohol. This is going to take the carbon dust, contaminants, any oil from your skin off that arrow shaft. And when I do this, I'm going to be very careful not to wipe the mark off that I've made. So just going to clean an area a little bit bigger than the vane, wiping it down, etc. And you can see the dirt, debris, carbon dust, oil from your skin, whatnot, come off that arrow shaft. And this being 91%, it's going to evaporate pretty quick. So I'm just going to set that there. I'm going to put the arrow shaft back into the jig. Got the vein in the clamp, got the alcohol on it, and you can see all that residue come off the vein. So we're removing oil, dirt, contaminants, dye, mold release agents, whatever's on the veins that you happen to use. We're getting all that off there, so we've got two clean, dry surfaces to adhere to each other. So now I'm going to grab my glue, Carbon Express Bond Archery Glue. This is a typical CA glue, a cyroacrylate, or super glue if you will. I'm going to apply a decent bead of it to the entire foot of the vein. I prefer a lot of glue. Some people don't like a lot of glue. I don't care if it runs out the sides. I just want to make sure I get a good bond. Place it in there. Set the vein down, get full contact. Gently apply pressure. And usually about 10 to 15 seconds is all you need for most of this cyroacrylate glue to form a workable bond so you can go on to the next vein. A lot of times I will use a CA activator, a spray form, comes in an aerosol or a pump, and what that does is it speeds up the curing time of any cyroacrylate glue. You can get it off Amazon, you can get it from any hobby shop, craft store, you can get it from any archery supply place, possibly pro shop might even carry it too, but it speeds up the process and it's almost instant when those two come together, those two chemicals. But for right now, just having good, clean, dry surfaces between the arrow shaft and the vein, using a good glue, we're going to get a workable bond within 10 to 15 seconds, enough to move on to the next one. So now, release the clamp, rotate the jig, grab another Gas Pro vein, and repeat the same process. I've got my alcohol on this paper towel. Clean the base of the vein. You see the dye, see the color come off. You know the vein is clean. Give it a second for the residual alcohol or solvent on there to evaporate. Apply a generous bead right down the middle of the base of the vein. Install the clamp. Press and hold firmly. You don't have to crush it. Just apply some pressure to force all the air out. About 10 to 15 seconds maybe. And then on to the third and final vein. Now some people talk about, oh, I really enjoy fletching arrows, it's so relaxing. Well, I tell you, when you fletch as many arrows as I do in a season, it's not really my favorite thing to do. So it's important to do it right the first time so you don't have to refletch, so you don't have to fix veins that are coming off or lifting off, what have you. And that's all in preparation. Getting everything nice and clean, using a high quality glue, maybe even an accelerant, and taking your time and doing it right the first time so you don't have to revisit it later on. And it's that 10 to 15 seconds to form a workable bond so we can complete the process of setting up this arrow. Now, one thing I'll do in addition, I take it out and I usually tend to inspect the vein orientation, make sure I've got them all and they're all at 120 degrees, nice and evenly spaced. And now what I'll do is a little preventative, one step further, is I'll place a small dab of glue at the tip and tail of each vein just to aid in the adhesion in case you pass through a target. Indoors it happens if you're hitting the same hole a lot, or you're shooting on soft targets. Just a little bit of glue, tip and tail, helps to keep that vein seated down there, right? Once you put a little bit of glue on the tip and tail of the vein, it's going to take a little bit to dry, so don't go spinning it. You're going to be flinging glue off, getting glue everywhere, etc. So this is pretty much done. The back end of this arrow is complete. Now I'm going to move on to cutting this arrow to length, squaring the end on the arrow squaring device, and then actually selecting and installing my components, my points, getting them to the right weight, and putting this in with the low temp hot melt. Now we've got the back end of the arrow all assembled. We have all the components installed. The arrow's fletched. It's fletched on that indexing mark that I put together earlier on the seam. I'm going to go over to the saw now, set the length based off one of my older arrows, cut the arrow, square it, clean the inside, We're going to take a look at points, point weights, and installation technique. I'm moving over to the saw. I've got one of my other tank 27s right here. I've taken the liberty to preset the saw right here, and what I'm shooting right now is 29 inches of shaft from carbon to carbon. Now, anytime you're using an arrow saw, you have to take some safety precautions. So I've got my awesome dust mask here, my safety glasses. We have a dust collector capture vacuum here. Now, what you might have noticed when I finished cutting this arrow shaft is I actually went a couple more revolutions on the saw than were needed with the arrow shaft, and I'm rotating the arrow into the blade. Now, by going around a couple additional times, what that does is it helps to square the face of this cut, get it nice and clean. Under high speed, this blade's going to have a little bit of oscillation to it. No matter what blade, no matter what saw you have, it just helps to get that nice and flat, nice and square. And to test that, I'm going to put my finger on it. I'm going to rotate it, and if there's any high spot or low spot in there, I'm going to feel a bump, and it feels pretty good. But to make sure I've got it square, I'm going to grab my G5 ASD tool, arrow squaring device. I'm going to put that arrow shaft against it, and I'm just going to go back and forth a couple of times with that diamond face on there, and that just squares that up perfectly smooth now. So with the arrow shaft cut, with it squared, I'm going to clean the inside of the arrow shaft, and then we're going to move on to selecting a point and installing it. So now that I've got the front end of the arrow shaft cut and squared on the ASD, I'm going to clean the inside of the arrow, because what I'm going to do there by cleaning it is remove any carbon dust or debris from cutting it or from manufacturing. I do this a couple of different ways. Sometimes I'll use a Q-tip and just swab the inside, and other times I'll just dunk it and rinse it around the first couple inches of the arrow shaft, and what that does is just kind of float out any of those debris. Wipe off the excess on the outside, dab it out, make sure I get it all out of the inside. Now I've got a nice, clean, dry surface for that hot melt or epoxy to adhere to. So now I'm ready to move on to my points. And these arrows, I'm going to be shooting the 210 grain points from Carbon Express that accept screw-in weight system, okay? This is a 210. I'm going to add 85 grains to the back of it, screw it in, secure it with my fingers. And the screws are actually metric, so you'll need to use a metric wrench or the Carbon Express adjustable weight wrench, the long one that goes in from the back of the arrow shaft. And I'll actually grab the points with pliers slightly and just snug these down, because you don't want them to vibrate out, come loose, shoot off the back end of the arrow, what have you. So just snugging that down, you don't got to go super tight, just get it snug. Now I'm going to move on to getting the torch set up, using a low temp hot melt, and installing these points. So now I have my arrow shaft cut, squared, and cleaned. I have my point with the adjustable weight installed, 210 grain point, 85 grain weight. I use the pliers to hold the point, just a little bit of torque on the Allen wrench to secure the weight in there. I'm actually going to move on to installing it. I've got my propane torch here. I've got the pliers to hold the point, and I've got a very low temperature hot melt glue. This is actually bonding glue. You can use any hot melt as long as it's a low temp that offers a flexible bond. After I heat up the point, heat up the glue, get the glue on the point, install it, wipe the excess off, I'm going to quench the arrow shaft in the point in this cup of water here. Just speeds up the cooling off time. So get this torch fired up. I'll heat up both parts. Get that glue going on there. Just get a nice bead of it all the way around, fill all the grooves. I'll heat the point again, heating that glue that's on there. As I install the point into the arrow shaft, I'm actually going to rotate it just a little bit to evenly spread that glue around, sink it down with the pliers. One quick go on the torch, shut the torch off. I will roll the shaft and wipe off the excess glue, and then quench the whole thing right in this cup of water. After installing the point, wiping the excess glue, quenching the arrow in a cup of cold water, it'll sit for a few seconds, cool everything down. This way you're not going to burn yourself on the point, any residual hot melt glue that might be on there, and it just speeds up the curing and process of the glue a little bit. Take it out, wipe off the water, everything looks good, and that's the process I go through to build my new Tank 27s.